In 1970, a young graduate student from Carnegie Mellon University attended an Episcopal cathedral in Pittsburgh. And he did so 2 weeks before his master's thesis was due. His name was John Michael. And although he was initially interested in writing on Greek and Roman mythology, his interest and energy were waning considerably, and it seemed like he was definitely not going to be meeting his deadline. And during this time, he was becoming deeply fascinated with the Gospels in the Bible. In the Gospels, he encountered something in a way that he had never encountered it before, and that was joy. And so with 2 weeks left before his deadline, he decided to seek some inspiration and try to experience some more of that joy that he felt expressed in the Gospels. So he decided to go to the most important worship service of the entire liturgical year, which you all know because I've said so many times, the most important worship service of the entire liturgical year, the Easter Vigil service. So he attended the Easter Vigil service at St. Paul's Cathedral in Pittsburgh. And on that night, John Michael wore his usual t-shirt with overalls, which some of the parishioners did not approve of. They turned their heads and gave him some looks of displeasure. And apparently one of the parishioners, who was a police officer, was so suspicious of him that he actually frisked him for drugs after the service. Needless to say, poor John Michael did not discover in the cathedral that same joy that he felt expressed in the Gospels. He said, "I left with the feeling that rather than rolling the rock away from the tomb, they were piling more on." Although this was disappointing for John Michael, it also proved to be actually motivating and inspiring for him, because he then went home, took out the manuscript, and worked it to completion in a non-stop frenzy. And this manuscript became his thesis, which eventually became the script for one of the most successful off-Broadway musical plays in history. John Michael said that he wanted the musical play to convey the simple and joyful message that he felt the first time that he read the Gospels. And he wanted to recreate the sense of community, which he did not experience and did not share when he went to the church service. John Michael wanted others to experience the joy he discovered in reading the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are still in the season of Lent. However, today, as I've already indicated, we are not wearing our usual purple vestments, but rather our new rose pink vestments, which we only wear twice a year. On Gaudete Sunday, which is the third Sunday of Advent, and Laetare Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Lent, which is today. These days function as joyful respites in the midst of penitential seasons, reminding us that the great and glorious feasts that we await, Christmas and Easter, are just around the corner. So take courage and be joyful. Laetare and Gaudete are both Latin ways of saying rejoice. And that's exactly what our scripture readings for today invite us to do, to discover joy. In our wonderfully brief reading from Joshua, we learn about God rolling away the disgrace of Egypt for the Israelites by feeding the children of Israel with food produced from the land. It's the first time they're eating food produced from their land, the Promised Land. After decades of slavery in Egypt and wandering in the wilderness, the Israelites finally discover the joy of arriving at home. Just as God rolled away the disgrace of Egypt for the Israelites, so too does God roll away the sins and transgressions of his people with his forgiveness. As the psalmist of Psalm 32 exclaims, "Happy and joyful are those whose sins and transgressions have been forgiven, whose sins have been rolled away, which have been put away." Or as the Apostle Paul puts it, "Everything old has passed away. See, everything has become new." And then Paul continues to elaborate on the joy that he has discovered in his ministry of reconciliation. And our gospel reading includes one of the most beloved and familiar parables of Jesus, which is all about the joy of reconciliation within a family. In the parable, we witness the joyful reconciliation between a loving and forgiving and generous father and a reckless and eventually repentant son. And this joyful reconciliation between father and son has inspired masterpieces by painters such as Rembrandt and authors such as one of my favorites, Catholic priest Henry Nouwen, and also William Shakespeare. In fact, out of all of the parables of Jesus, it is this parable of the prodigal son that most influenced Shakespeare in the writing of his plays. However, this parable, like most of Jesus' parables, when you really start to look at them, it leaves us a little bit in the lurch, particularly regarding this unresolved relationship between the two brothers. The joy that characterizes this day, Laetare Sunday, and the joy expressed in the other scripture readings is slightly tainted by this apparent resentment of the older brother. And it might go both ways. That's how the parable ends, with this sibling tension and resentment. And the joy of the day and the readings can easily turn into personal conviction and maybe even some sorrow, as this sibling tension may remind us of resentments within our own families and communities, grudges that we might hold against friends and neighbors and fellow parishioners and loved ones. And perhaps this is exactly what Jesus is inviting us to consider by leaving us in the lurch. Perhaps he's calling us to recognize the ways that we are like the older brother, and the ways that we cling to our own self-righteousness at the expense of wholeness and reconciliation and joy. The gospel invites us to rejoice on this Laetare Sunday and to let go of those things that we think make us righteous, but are ultimately joy killers. Sometimes we find power and even strange pleasure in holding a grudge against someone whom we feel has offended or wounded or disrespected us or our family or our community. And I confess that I'm guilty of this. I get some strange pleasure in holding a grudge. But the truth is that holding a grudge against someone is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Doesn't make sense. So let us not drink that poison. It kills our joy and it destroys our soul. New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine has tried to understand how the original Jewish listeners of Jesus' parables understood these parables in the first century. She has a great book titled Short Stories by Jesus, enigmatic parables of a controversial rabbi. And in this book, Amy Jill Levine hears this parable of the prodigal son, provoking listeners and us with the following exhortations. Recognize, she says, that the one you have lost may be right in your own household. Do whatever it takes to find the lost, and then celebrate with others so that you can share the joy. Don't wait until you receive an apology. You may never get one. Don't wait until you can muster the ability to forgive. You may never find it. Don't stew in your sense of being ignored, for there is nothing that can be done to retrieve the past. Instead, go have lunch. Go celebrate and invite others to join you. If the repenting and forgiving come later, so much the better. And if not, you still will have done what is necessary. You will have begun a process that might lead to reconciliation. You will have opened a second chance for wholeness and joy. I just came across a quote this morning that said, "I didn't realize how strong I was until I forgave someone who was not sorry and accepted an apology I did not receive." John Michael's musical play was a modern and comedic retelling of the life of Jesus set in New York City, with a particular emphasis on Jesus' parables. In his retelling of the parable of the prodigal son, John Michael adds to the story by providing a joyful reconciliation between the two brothers. That's what the parables actually invite us to do, to imagine how we would finish the story. And in the play, the brothers initially refuse to even look at each other. But then the father comically knocks the brothers' heads together so that they fall on their knees and then hug as the father says, "Them's my boys." And then the scene ends with everyone cheering and applauding enthusiastically at restoration and reconciliation within the family. If you haven't already guessed it, the musical play I'm talking about is Godspell, which John Michael Tebelak wrote after attending that Easter Vigil service. And all of the songs in Godspell are inspired and based on Episcopal hymns, including that chart-topping single Day by Day, which we will sing during our communion. John Michael Tebelak was a lifelong Episcopalian who actually considered ordination, considered becoming a priest at one point in his life, and eventually served as the drama and liturgy consultant at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the largest Gothic cathedral in the world, in New York City, where there is now a theater named after him, the Tebelak Theater. And if he were on the church's calendar of saints, his feast day would be the day after tomorrow, because he died on April 2nd of a heart attack at a young age. He was 35. And apparently, he died of a heart attack because he had too big of a heart. Although I'll admit I'm personally not the hugest fan of Godspell. It's a little too 1970s for me. But I very much admire John Michael Tebelak and very much appreciate how effectively his masterpiece captures the gospel's invitations to discover joy. To discover joy by not taking ourselves so seriously, by letting go of our grudges, which are really only hurting us, by practicing gratitude, which is the key to instant happiness and joy, and by falling headlong into the loving and forgiving arms of our most generous God, who joyfully says to each of us, "All that is mine is yours." Amen.